everyone, and welcome to the first ever Global Impact Virtual Conference hosted by ISTE community leaders. This experience will showcase how remarkable educators worldwide are making a big impact in global education. My name is Amelia Leogas, and I am part of ISTE Community Leaders Global Impact Team, joining you today from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. I'm thrilled to be your host today for the session entitled Equity, Education, Storytelling, and EdTech, a Love Story. Our presenter for this session is Dr. Sawsan Jabber, joining us from the United States of America. Dr. Jabber is a global educator, presenter, equity strategist, curriculum designer, and keynote speaker of 20 plus years from the US. Dr. Jabber was awarded the Cook County Teacher of the Year in 2023, IDEA Teacher of the Year in 2022, and has been nominated as the Illinois Teacher of the Year for 2023. So without much further ado, let's get started.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be with you today and to share a little bit of this love story with you. I want to invite all of you to feel free to ask questions throughout the session, and Amalia is going to be kind enough to read them out and let me know when there's questions in the chat and to make comments if you feel like there's something that you want to delve a little bit deeper into. And I want to also invite everyone to really use the chat to kind of have some conversations, because the virtual space is a little bit challenging in making this a little bit more catered to the audience. And so using the chat helps with that. And so the session is titled, as Maya said, Equity, Education, and Storytelling. And it definitely is a love story because these are the roots of so much of where we are today and kind of where I am at in my journey as an educator and as a human being in the world today. And so I want to get started because I always have more content than I have time to share. And so with that, I always like to contextualize where I am spiritually and just mentally and kind of in the world. And so as an English teacher by trade and an English teacher by heart and an English teacher by craft and crafting, I always like to start with poetry because Ajamunay says, poetry is the language of the dispossessed. It is our belonging. And so with that, I'm going to start with a few verses from Hamid al-Kurd anthology called Rifqa, which was dedicated to his grandmother. And I'm going to start in the middle of the page where he says, 2008, during the Gaza bombings, my ritual of watching TV ran between grieving and Egyptian belly dance music. I fluctuated between hatred and adoration, stacking and hoarding Darwish's reasons to live. Sometimes believing them, sometimes dipping my bread in indulgence, knowing a child is breadless in Khan Yunis, dipped in a roof's rubble. If you ask me where I'm from, it's not a one-word answer. Be prepared, seated, sober, geared up. If hearing about a world other than yours makes you uncomfortable, drink the sea, cut off your ears, blow another bubble to bubble your bubble, and the pretense. Blow up another town of bodies in the name of fear. This is why we dance. My father told me anger is a luxury we cannot afford. Be composed, calm, still, laugh when they ask you, smile when they talk, answer them, educate them. This is why we dance. If I speak, I'm dangerous. You open your mouth, raise your eyebrows, you point your fingers. This is why we dance. We have wounded feet, but the rhythm remains. No matter the adjectives on my shoulders, this is why we dance, because screaming isn't free. Please tell me why anger, even anger, is a luxury to me. And I start with that because that's where I am. And this is the reason why. This is a big reason of my why, which I'll get into later. And so I want us to use this opportunity to really kind of take a moment of silence and center the voices of our ancestors and really think of one person, just one person, an ancestor by a bloodline, an ancestor by an intersection of your identity, a religious ancestor, or an ancestor of where you come from. For me, sometimes it's Martin Luther King. Sometimes it's a prophet from my faith. Sometimes it's my great-grandmother. Sometimes it's my grandfather. It depends on where I am and what I'm thinking about. And so think of an ancestor that you kind of want to center today and you want to channel, and place the name of that person in the chat. I'll give you a minute to do that. Someone who really shaped you and who really helped you become who you are. For me, I'm going to center the voice of my great-grandmother, a Palestinian freedom fighter. Her name was Jamila Jabir. And I'm also thinking about today, 75 years and 207 days of occupation, 40,000 massacred Palestinians, and according to the World Health Organization, 100,000 with the people who are under the rubble, 15,000 children who've been murdered in the most brutal ways in front of the eyes of the world, 25,000 children who are orphaned, and the countless Palestinians who've been gravely injured in life-altering ways. There's no way that I can talk about anything without centering all of those things and bringing them to the surface at the forefront of all of my work. And with that, I'm going to share a little bit of my love story because it's one that was born out of hate, misrepresentation, and misunderstanding, which, putting love and all of those words together, is very unusual, right? Again, my name is Dr. Sawsan, and I consider myself a storyteller, and that's how I introduce myself always. And that is because my Arab Palestinian identity was passed down to me through people like my great-grandmother, my grandfather, my parents, who have all navigated being Palestinian in their different contexts in different ways. And so even though I never had the privilege of being in Palestine until my mid-30s for the first time, I grew up in the most Palestinian home in the center of Brooklyn. And that's because my parents, as refugees, ensured that we always understood where we were coming from. And those were stories that were passed down to us from our great-grandmother, our grandfather, and our parents. I'm also a Muslim, and like many people from many faiths, my faith is also passed down to me through parables in our Holy Quran. And so those are stories that I carry very dear and near to my heart and that shape a big intersection of my identity. I'm as proud of those identities as I am to be an American. Born and raised in Brooklyn, I grew up in one of the most diverse communities in the 80s. And it was probably one of the biggest things that shaped my perspective in life because from a very young age, I recognized the beauty and privilege of diversity and of growing up in what was then called a melting pot, but we know now is definitely not the best term, right? But unfortunately, my American identity has silenced both my Arab Palestinian and my Muslim identities throughout my entire life. And especially in educational spaces, whether it was me as a child and as a learner and my journey from K through 20, or me as a professional in those same spaces. And so I start with this because as a storyteller, I'm going to tell you a few stories. This slide was from a conference a few years ago, in a conference that was considered an equity conference. And this was a group of people, it was thousands of people in the room, and they started the entire conference by trying to define marginalized groups. And so as you can see in this slide, in that listing of marginalized groups, there is no indication of Arabs or Muslims, even though they are some of the most, especially post 9/11, post-Trump, with the Muslim ban and a lot of the rhetoric that's existed in both the media and the news and in politics, right? And especially in election periods. And that has really emanated internationally, right? There's no mention of one of the most visible groups of people, or two of the most visible groups of people when it comes to marginalization. So we are hyper visible when it comes to inequity and oppression, but invisible when it comes to any kind of advocacy. And so that was a really big thing for me because here I am in an educational space, sitting in an equity conference, and my identity is being erased even in that space. I always love to share this story because this was one of my first realizations as an educator that this was never going to go away, right? And so I was standing in front of my classroom. It was first thing in the morning, and a teacher, and I was talking to my students and starting the day out with my kids after a weekend, and a teacher walked into my classroom. She put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "How are you doing this morning after what your people did in France?" And it took me a second to realize that she was referencing ISIS and the bombing that they had committed in France that weekend, and that she saw my hijab as a representation, and when she referenced my people to her were ISIS. And I just immediately, my mind went to thinking about the students in that space and thinking about how they were reading that situation and what the implications of that were, especially since I was working in a district that had a 600% growth annually of kids who look like me. And so how was this idea being perpetuated across her classrooms in the spaces that she was teaching when she was interacting with kids who also wore the hijab and who came from Arab backgrounds. So I started to dig. It was the beginning of my doctoral journey. And I thought to myself, let me see what's out there as far as the research is concerned. Surprisingly, I only found 2 researchers covering Arab American students, one which kind of said 1 in 3 Arab students were bullied by a teacher. And I want us to kind of sit with that for a minute, because when we think about adolescent experiences and what it means to be an adolescent in a middle school anywhere in the world, we recognize that adolescents are going through self-concept issues. They're trying to figure out who they are in the world. They're trying to figure out who their friends are, what their personality is, what their place is, who are we in a world that's constantly today inundating them through social media with different ideas of who they should be, right? Navigating that and navigating these spaces is already violent enough, because kids bully kids, right? And kids have internal, we know more than ever, social emotional issues that are kind of hindering their ability to just be. And so let's conflate that with bullying by a teacher and think about what that does to a kid. Right? And then let's think about the dehumanization and the criminalization that happens in so many of our schools, whether it's from teachers or the curriculum that the gatekeepers decide to teach. And think about, what stories do we hear and what stories do we not hear? And who controls what stories make it to school curriculum and what stories are omitted? Who are the gatekeepers? And so with that, the story continues through generations, right? This is my great-grandmother, Jamila Jabed. You can see her kind of fighting in 1948 when our village was attacked and occupied, in one of the first villages to be occupied. This is my great-grandfather, who passed on the need for education, my grandfather, who passed on the idea that education was a form of liberation and really planted that seed, even through our kids. My parents, who are refugees, who never had the privilege of continuing their education and telling their story. And so they passed that torch on to us by being able to create the situations and kind of cultivate a place for us to navigate educational spaces, to be ordered, to occupy spaces like this and be able to tell our stories. And this is me at 6. The first time I realized that my identity was problematic, when my teacher asked me to put a thumbtack on where I came from on the map, because I grew up in a place that had a lot of people from different places, but still very few Arabs. And I couldn't find my country on the map, and she was so frustrated with me. My daughter, who at high school, my youngest daughter, who went to school with me, I always say she finished school with me, and was asked to apologize for 9/11 in front of her English class in her sophomore year. And that is my youngest daughter and my oldest daughter. And you can see that my youngest daughter does not wear her hijab. And that is primarily because her middle school experience, even though there were 40% of kids who look like her, had so much aggressive bullying, of identity-based bullying, that she felt like putting her hijab on would just cause and aggravate that even more. And the first time that we saw representation, which was in an ISTE space 2 years ago, that looked anything accurate in 20 years of education and 20 years of being an educator, was in a booth in a ISTE conference center, where I saw a pin that looked like my daughter, as you can see. And that was the first time ever that I saw representation that looks remotely accurate of who we were. And just thinking to myself in that moment, how could this experience have been so much more transformative if I had the opportunity to see myself reflected in an educational space, in a classroom, accurately, where a teacher actually made that choice consciously. And so who's historically told our stories, right? We have to ask that question. Who owns those stories, and why haven't they been told in educational spaces? And what is that hidden curriculum? The world, right? Telling us about identities when we don't share their stories out loud, or when we share single stories about who they are. How does that operate on students' self-concept? And how do they feel about themselves? And how does that impact their opportunity to dream about their futures, or shape a future that they determine for themselves versus one that the world determines for them? And how do we help them to notice, name, and interrupt, making those pathways of a dream an actual reality? And so again, I always do this because I feel like it's so important to center, right, what our students are experiencing internationally throughout the world. And we have to recognize and understand that whatever happens in one part of the earth no longer is just relative to those people of that part of the earth, because now, through technology, through the internet, through all of these different things, we all have access to the world, and we are all feeling and experiencing the world in real time. And so what happens in Palestine, what happens in Sudan, what happens in Syria, what happens in every part of the world is something that affects every single one of our children. What happens on our southern border in the United States, what happens with the Black Lives Matter movement. We see the world commenting and we see the world engaging and interacting with all of those different things. And that's one of the reasons why I feel like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have become so central in really helping us navigate some of those conversations and understand the domino effect of current events. And so here's the world through the lens of our students. So how does that require us to reframe our practice and really redefine equity? Because post George Floyd, internationally, equity became a conversation, a real conversation in schools. And the cool new thing in education too is who can really speak about equity in ways that was transformative and who can bring the new book in and what new practices can we incorporate into our classes to do equity. And what happened was we ended up with a lot of performative action, things that we do that feel good for us, but don't actually change the status quo for our students or the world. They don't transform the world in any shape or form. And so let's really think about how we can deconstruct what we already know so that we can reconstruct understandings that are actually meaningful and better and transformative, right? And so we think about curriculum as a dehumanizing force because in many schools it is, right? Like I can speak to my experiences going through schools and working with schools and consulting in schools and looking at curriculum as a curriculum specialist and finding that Arab Americans and Muslim Americans only show up in curriculum in deficit ways. And so think about your own experiences in schools. Where have you read about us, right? Let's think about the fact that we have all now put Juneteenth on the calendar as a national holiday, but nobody really knew what Juneteenth was until last year or the year before. And as soon as we made it a national holiday, we made it illegal to talk about it in schools, right? And so what is being told and what isn't being told, and how does then curriculum really become a tool in some spaces or a weapon in others, right? What makes it okay for 100,000 Palestinian Arabs to be killed, murdered on our watch, right, by displaying their traumas publicly in front of the world, and the rest of the world to start saying the tides are starting to change? But it took 100,000 people to die for the tides just to begin changing, because we've done such a good job dehumanizing and criminalizing Arabs in general, Palestinians in particular, for us to desensitize people from feeling and reacting to the images that they're seeing in different spaces, if they're seeing those images at all with all these algorithms, right? Or deny the truth of what they're seeing. And so it becomes really important for us to acknowledge the curriculum violence that's happening in schools when we are telling kids that who they are isn't good enough. And I can tell you story after story of through my consulting experiences of teachers teaching Black literature and telling students things like, the way the characters in the story speak is inappropriate, negating the way students speak, right? Or this book represents all of you, taking a book with a Mexican character and saying that it represents a whole group of Mexican students, like their identity is that one-dimensional, that one book can characterize all of them. This is all forms of curriculum violence that happen in classrooms across the world, right? Because teachers have not done the work to immerse themselves in conversations, in communities, in understanding experiences other than their own lived experiences. And so they carry that violence and perpetuate it on students all the time. And what does that look like when we're actually constantly being violent with students through the curriculum? Eventually that does something that Bettina Love calls spirit murdering, where kids then feel like they are no longer able to bring their whole selves into a space. And as a result, they have to form the sense of double consciousness to survive violent spaces in schools, which we know through research, once a student forms a sense of double consciousness, they make 25% less gains than other children who feel like they can bring their whole selves into that space. And so what does that look like? And I've seen that happen when I've worked in Dubai. I've seen it happen when I've worked with schools in Jordan. I've seen it happen with my consulting with schools in South Africa. I've seen it happen here in the United States very prevalently. And so it is universal, right? It just looks maybe a little bit different from country to country, but this is happening all over the world. And so we want to talk about transformative equity versus the mitigative approaches to equity, which really exist in a lot of our schools, right? Like, it's not enough to be culturally responsive. So many of our schools put a book that looks like the students in front of them, but how are we teaching those texts, right? And in how many schools are we thinking about what groups of people are not represented in our student body, and how important is it for us, knowing that this is a global community, for us to really integrate those texts so we can teach our kids to navigate and to understand different people no matter where they are in the world, right? Because the world is so much smaller because of technology. How many of the adults that are teaching kids can do those things and think about them? And so we want to cultivate something called global citizenship, right? And that has to start with us, because teaching is a very personal experience, and you can't do these things with kids if you haven't done them first yourself. And so let's define the characteristics of what a global citizen is. And I would encourage people to tweet, to put comments and questions, and to do these things, because I believe very heavily in the power of social media. And especially as a Palestinian today, what is changing the narrative? Because what we're seeing in Palestine isn't new. What we're seeing in Palestine, and this is not a session about Palestine, but you can't talk about these things without talking about Palestine, is been there for 75 plus years, right? And so what's new is the fact that social media is bringing a different narrative to the surface. And so use your social media to really kind of cultivate these conversations on a larger scale. And I believe that so much of my great learning has happened through social media as well as a current educator. And so please tweet out things that really, or whatever, I know it's not even Twitter anymore, but whatever platform you're using, share learning that you've done, questions that you have. What does this kind of raise for you as a person? Like, what issues and what things are you thinking about? Feel free to share. I'd love to hear your thoughts throughout the presentation. And so a dreamer, a global citizen is a radical dreamer. And if we want to really define radical dreamers are George Washington, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, people who looked at the world and said, this isn't good enough, right? And they didn't just sit on that thought, but said, we deserve better, and we're going to make the moves to do something better, not just for myself, but for a larger group of people. And they fought for it, and in some cases even died for it. And so we want to think about those people as radical dreamers who could dream of a future that's better than the one that we're living in today, right? Everybody who worked to end slavery in the civil rights movement was a radical dreamer. And so many people who come from Black backgrounds today who are able to get up and speak their truths are living out the dreams of many of those radical dreamers. So what can we continue to dream that will make the future a better place? And how can we cultivate the ability for kids to dream in our classroom spaces so that they can think about global citizenship and think about their dreams as something that they can work towards actualizing? And even if they put the foundational blocks there, right, we might never live to see our radical dreams come to fruition, but we can put the building blocks for other people to take over and build on. How do we have a strong self-concept? How do we counter all of the stigmas from the world, especially for our marginalized groups that are internationally marginalized, and in every country that looks a little bit different? But how can we think about cultivating and countering all of the hidden curriculum messages and all of the curricular messages in order for our kids to feel like they love themselves enough to be able to radically dream? How can we cultivate scholar activism? How can we cultivate a generation of kids who are able to really ask those critical questions? Instead of just being content consumers, they become content creators. And instead of just consuming information, they're able to take that information, interrogate it, and come up with their own truth, instead of realizing that whatever they're seeing in television and in social media oftentimes is someone else's truth. And how can we help them understand themselves as part of a larger context, right? Because I call this generation the selfie generation, and many of them are so self-absorbed because we've kind of shaped the world in that way, right? This is the selfie generation. And so how do we break them out of that kind of self-centered ideal into thinking of themselves as a part of a larger context, whether that's their local context or their national context or their international context? Because as we established earlier, everything that happens in one part of the world impacts the other part of the world. And we see that with something as simple and clear as the environment. And how do we get them to recognize their power and to be bold and fearless, right? We're seeing a little bit of that with the college encampments that are happening all over the world, but primarily in the United States with regards to Palestine today, right? That is bold. And how do we cultivate that in our instruction for all kids all the time? And so it requires mindset shifts. And the first one is we can't do equity. You can't walk into a classroom and just do equity. You can't plan equity when you're planning your lesson plans or when you're writing a policy, right? We have to be equity. It's a state of being. It's a practice, right? I don't have to be an educator in a school to recognize that I have a place in this national conversation that's happening now about a genocide. I don't have to have Black students or teach Black students to recognize that I have a responsibility to ensure that the Black narrative and that Black lives do matter and have a really big, heavy hand in shifting that narrative as well. Even though I'm not Black, right? I don't have Black children in my classrooms, but I do have a responsibility to shift that narrative because I am someone who really centers their life on equity. I have a responsibility to position myself as an educator and as a person in ways that will continue to grow my mind and understanding of groups of people who don't look like me. I teach in a district that is primarily Latina. I am not Latina. And so it requires me to really immerse myself in a Latina community to understand how to serve my students better. And so what shifts am I making to really be an equitable person in my personal life so that when I show up in my professional life, I'm showing up with that lens all the time? Because we can't say we're equitable if we constantly silo ourselves in communities that look like us in our personal spaces. That does impact how we show up in professional spaces for sure. The second mindset shift is that we can't continue to work for our students. We cannot continue to be the gatekeepers of what education and instruction looks like for them. We need to cultivate agency by working with them. When we have students that are a part of what their instruction looks like, and they have a heavy hand in what that shape and the creation of that co-creation of curriculum looks like, then our schools are going to better serve the needs of students because no longer are we deciding what's best for them and missing the mark, but we're doing that work with them. We need to stop centering culture. Yes, culture is one of the reasons why marginalization exists in many places, but it's not the only reason. We need to start centering equity instead. And that looks like considering all the factors that make inequity a reality and working against them. That is socioeconomics, that is gender, that is religion, that is culture. And that's a lot of other things, ability versus disability, right? It's a bunch of different other factors that we don't take into account when we're only centering culture. And that's why cultural responsiveness is great, but it cannot be our ceiling. We need to stop focusing on skill building and content. Like this is a conversation that when I worked in Dubai, we spent hours looking at international testing and where we scored on an international in an international place. We do the same here in the United States with standardized tests. And it's constantly about skill and drill. And that's not anything that's meaningful to kids. And that's why we are failing as educational systems. We need to start focusing on identity, criticality, and intellectualism. And skills, right? It's a combination of all four of those things together. Goldie Mohammed talks about it in her book, Cultivating Genius, and Shane Safir calls us holism, right? Thinking about a student's whole self versus just looking at them as an academic. And finally, we need to stop considering schools in general as apolitical. Like I can't stand the idea of when teachers say, I can't talk about Palestine, it's too political. What is political about the human experience? And if we start labeling things as political, then that is also very political. Schools are a place for us to cultivate critical conversations about real world issues so that our students can understand what democratic societies all over the world should look like. They belong in school. And when we are determining what is and isn't allowed to come in school, that is very political already, right? We are making political decisions when we're deciding that something is too political for it to be in a school setting. And as we can see censorship in the United States happening, we see that there are gatekeepers determining what can and can't be talked about in schools. And often it's the marginalized voices that are being omitted. And so we really need to focus on a liberatory curriculum. And that is the cultivation of and looking at the 4 pillars of self-awareness, because it starts with yourself, social awareness, understanding the world, storytelling, and being able to really own your story and reclaim it as a marginalized group. And then thinking about all of those things and then ask yourself, like I ask my students, now that you know, what will you do with what you know? Because everything we know has to be a conduit to action, right? Sitting on what we know doesn't change anything for anyone. So it's not enough for us to educate ourselves, but it's what we do with that education that makes a difference. And all of this is, yes, we need to do this with kids, but it starts with doing it with ourselves first, because we can't transfer something that we don't have. Right? We have a saying in Arabic that says "faqad ash-shay' la yu'ti," which means if I don't have something, I can't give it to you. And so how can we give something to kids if we don't have it? It starts with cultivating those skills within ourselves first. And centering social justice across the board. So we have to see the power in the product, and that is the power of storytelling, because stories humanize, they connect, they inspire, they preserve, they redefine and transform. And that's the power of the counter story, right? And I always tell my students, this parable is what we start with. Until the lion learns to write every story, we'll always glorify the hunter. We will never hear the fight that the lion put up because the lion doesn't have the power to tell his own story. So how can we shift the power in our classrooms to give the lion the privilege of writing and telling his story, which is a beautiful story that has power and resistance, right, in it. And so we want to think about history also, the history of literacy, right? Who has held the power of literacy, and how has the power of literacy been withheld from marginalized groups so that their story is co-opted from them? So the weapon of illiteracy has been a real thing in marginalized groups, right? Even if we watch our daily news, and I want everybody to be cognizant, how many news broadcasts you see where they're interviewing people about Palestine without ever having a Palestinian on the panel? Who tells our stories? How does that impact the way a story is told if it's not the people of the story telling the story themselves? And so there's a video that I wanted to show here, but I will not show it because we are kind of running out of time and I want to make sure I leave room for questions. But there's a lot that happens, and I have so many products of students telling their stories. And if you were at ISTE last year, you saw the power of 3 students standing up in front of 20,000 people telling their stories fearlessly on a stage. That's what happens when we center our students and center equity. They become fearless. They are so much stronger than we are. And we see that today on the college campuses in the United States with kids taking a stance that so many adults were afraid to take. It was kids starting in campus and then professors joining them, not the other way around. That says a volume about the kids being fearless when they're empowered to take that action and really love themselves first. And so they tell their own stories from a place of power and pride. They listen to the stories of others from a place of empathy and understanding, not pity, hate, or skepticism. And they determine their own life stories, not the ones others have determined for them. And that's the biggest way. They decide their pathway, right? I'm not going to follow in the footsteps of people who have had the power, have crafted for me. I'm going to create my own pathway. It's huge. And again, that's what we're seeing on college campuses across the board. Not only are they fighting for something that's not necessarily personal to them, they're fighting for something global because they've realized that that is personal to them, right? And that's huge. So my final thing for all of you today is to be a good ancestor, right? We started out with our ancestors and we're going to end with our ancestor, because at the end of the day, we all have to realize that we are going to go, and what's going to be left behind is what we've done in the world. And so I always wonder, like, if my grandkids ask me, Siti, which is what we call a grandmother, what did you do in 2024 when the genocide was happening? I want to be able to answer honestly and say that I did whatever I could with my power and my positionality to be on the right side of history. And I hope that that's the stance that we always want to take. And it doesn't require things as big as a genocide for us to cultivate and start putting in and planting the seeds for these things not to happen proactively instead of us constantly being reactive. Education is the place for this to change. I always say teachers are the most powerful people in the world. And we're devalued in so many parts of the world. But the reality is that we cultivate and craft the future of tomorrow by deciding what education looks like and what conversations our students are engaging in. And so what kind of a future? I always ask this question because it's the truth, because it's something I always think about. What kind of a world do I want my grandkids to grow up in? Definitely not this one. And so what is my locus of control in shifting the world as it looks today? Because I know I have power. And so growing into that power, despite what the world says educators do, and I remember that I always share this story too, is that when I told my mom I wanted to be a teacher, she cried so much and she didn't talk to me for a few months because she was so disappointed that I wanted to be a teacher, genuinely, because culturally, all those who go into humanities are people who couldn't get into the sciences, so you had to be a lesser student, and she thought I was too smart to just be a teacher. And today she realizes that every president, every politician, every person with power sat in a classroom first. So how can we cultivate people who are more globally aware, who can really shift the narrative in our world today? And how can technology be a huge conduit to that? It's so much easier to tell stories in multiple modes. It's so much easier to share stories through multiple modes because of technology. It's become such a staple in equity today. And if we don't realize that as educators, we're shortchanging ourselves and we're shortchanging our students, and we're not really fully growing into our practice. And so with that, I always end with questions for reflection, because the road to equity is an endless one. Once we feel like we've figured something out, the world changes on us faster than we can imagine, and we have to figure out the next step. And so here are some questions that will kind of just get us to think about. How can we use instruction to create mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, ultimately leading students towards opportunities to be content creators? Is a huge one. How do we ensure that students are able to name, notice, and interrupt inequity? How do we use technology to provide students with authentic audiences beyond their class peers and really get them to connect with a global audience in impactful ways? How do we examine positionality, integrate connections to real-world events and skills, and develop critical consciousness and tools for civic engagement through instruction? All of those things are doable, and it's not at the expense of finishing curriculum. It's at the price of making education so meaningful that they're experiences that kids will never forget. And how do we normalize student feedback and build leadership ability through that process? And really think about getting students to be actively engaged and have the agency to be a part of their own learning. And so with that, I want to open the floor to questions and comments. And I hope everybody took something away from today. And I know this is not the whole conversation. It's just a drop in the ocean of a much larger conversation. But I hope that I have been able to pique your curiosity enough for you to continue asking questions and kind of doing this work with your students and with yourself, and kind of carry it through and recognize the power that you have as an educator in a classroom. Amalia, I think you're muted. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
There you go. I wanted to thank you for your inspiring words. And I know personally your words will remain with me and inspire deep reflection or with my teaching practices for the weeks to come. We do have some questions. Jamie Higgins asks, what do you tell educators who genuinely do this work but are afraid that it will make them a pariah?
I will say I'm not a person who beats around the bush and isn't real, right? Like, we have to be real. And you are going to be, there's always going to be pushback. When you are doing work that's going to change people's minds and hearts, there are going to be people who are going to push back and are going to push back in sometimes very aggressive and very harmful ways. And my way of navigating that has always been to look for a larger professional learning environment and community that I can lean into to support me. Sometimes that can happen in a building if you have enough people who are like-minded, and you can continue to kind of create and cultivate that on a larger scale with community. But sometimes, and again, this is where technology becomes a tool, where we can really cultivate and lean into communities that are international and national and find people who are like-minded to support us. This work is hard, right? But nothing good or nothing meaningful or nothing transformative doesn't come from some kind of level of hard work and dedication and sacrifice, right? Martin Luther King knew that. Nelson Mandela knew that, right? They made sacrifice. Angela Davis continues to do that, right? We see people in our own histories across the nation and across the world who have made those sacrifices. And so we need to think about the return in the gain. And that doesn't mean there has to be self-care, because you can't fill from an empty cup. And so I'm a part of the ISTE international community. I'm a part of Our Voice Alliance, which is a community of educators focused on equity as well. And I ensure that I am constantly leaning in on getting advice from, if I feel like I'm stuck in a corner, doing those things. But that fills my cup. And so do conferences that are really centered. And I get to take space with communities that are all thinking and feeling the same way.
Jennifer Martin has a question. My biggest concern, question, comment is how the educator cannot be everything. They cannot be the everything in learning. They burn out.
100%. And I don't think that you have to be everything, right? But this is a different lens in education. The way we're teaching in a lot of spaces does not appeal to our kids. Like I said, those images that I presented are things that kids are experiencing. And so, like, if you are a Palestinian student today, if you were a Black student when George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement was in full fledged, if you were a student during the southern border cages and all of that, those things were happening, you didn't care what your teachers were talking about. But if we teach in this way, we are asking students to leverage their lived experiences in education. And so the learning becomes much more meaningful. And we talk about developing schema so that learning becomes long-term. This is the way we develop schema. We make the learning meaningful so that the students can see that the things that we're teaching them are things and tools that they need to develop in order for them to live a different life than the one that exists today. And so it's not about you being everything. It's about transforming our practice so it's actually meaningful, not in the way that we learned or to us today, but to the kids that we're teaching in front of us. And so it's a shift in practice. It's not a change in your role as an educator, but a shift in what you're doing in order for that to become more meaningful to everybody who's involved. And in return, which is a big return, is that we get to shape a different future tomorrow because we are asking our kids to be more involved in a lot of the things that we're doing. I can't tell you how many schools sit here and talk about classroom management, and we're having so many issues with kids being engaged. This is the key to all of those things. When you're making the learning something that's meaningful to kids, I guarantee you all of your classroom management issues will completely disappear. Kids are going to be extremely engaged, and the learning is going to be long-term.
Are there any other questions? Well, Dr. Jabber, I thank you so much. I think we are all going to be reflecting on meaningful education for our students and how we can go about that. I hope everybody found the session on equity education, storytelling, and EdTech a love story, both informative and engaging. We'd like to know what you've learned from this session. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the chat to access a digital template to share your takeaways from this session. Be sure to share your takeaways on social media using hashtag global impact and hashtag ISTEGlobal. I'd like everybody who is backstage to come to the front just so we can see all the people that it takes to put together sessions as we go on. And Dr. Jabber, I have to tell you, I wrote down your opening line, poetry is the language of the dispossessed. It is our belonging. I'm going to frame that in my office.
Oh, I wish they were my words. They're not, but I'm not that poetic. I could just be an appreciator of poetry. I'm glad that resonated with you. It really resonates with me because I feel like I've always found myself in poetry in ways that I couldn't find myself in other places. And so thank you again for having me and for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this.
Thank you. And everyone, don't forget to register for ISTE Live. The link will be in the chat window. Up next at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we have Voice, AI, and Speaking for ESL students. We look forward to seeing everyone there. Have a good day.
Bye, all. Thank you, Dr. Jabber.
Thank you.